The glories of Southwest Michigan are not difficult to get to now. But in horse and buggy days, and even when motor cars began appearing in the early 20th century, pleasure trips in the countryside were not easy. Cars were unreliable.
But we've got to do something about those roads.
And roads could be treacherous. But as more Americans bought cars, the Good Roads movement grew. Berrien County's Good Roads Association formed in 1907, and by 1910, voters had passed a bond issue to improve local roads.
Mighty smooth riding now.
By 1910, a Chicagoan could boast of traveling the 91 miles to Lakeside on 4th of July weekend in 5 hours, an average of 18 miles an hour, slow by present standards, but a ride enjoyed greatly by Jane Addams, one of the most famous women in America at the time, founder of the country's first settlement house for immigrants, Hull House, a leader in the movement to enact child labor laws, who had helped establish the NAACP and would soon be a founding member of the ACLU, a peace activist who in 1931 would become the first American woman to win the Nobel Prize. As early as 1902, Addams was writing her sister proposing a family get-together at Mrs. West's boarding house in Lakeside. 8 years later, the St. Joe Herald-Press reported that Jane Addams had paid $6,000 for beachfront land in Lakeside, intending to establish a camp for underprivileged children. A month later, Berrien County property records show her buying an $1,800 property in the village. Her cottage was modest, set in the woods. It's marked as number 99 on this map of Lakeside's dwellings in the 1910s, located off M11, later known as Lakeshore Road, just south of Pier Street. Just down the road was the home of Eleanor Smith, music director at Hull House and one of Addams' closest friends. Also nearby was the brand-new Chickeming Country Club, which took the, at the time, unusual step of admitting single female members. Indeed, the club's initial 1912 membership rolls had Jane Addams atop the alphabetical list. If Addams ever established a camp in Lakeside for the underprivileged, it did not last long. By late 1911, Hull House had bought property in Waukegan, Illinois, soon to establish the Bowen Country Club, where for decades, children from inner-city Chicago enjoyed clean air and outdoor activity. But Jane Addams enjoyed her Michigan getaway for another 5 years. In 1915, the Three Oaks Acorn noted she was in town, adding, "Lakeside never so popular as this summer, not a vacant cottage." The next year, Jane Addams wrote a friend that she had sold her small bit of land in Lakeside for $3,500, about double what she had paid for it. After World War I, mass production cut the price of a car in half, within reach of an emerging middle class.
A car comes off the end of the line every 10 seconds.
As prices went down, the number of drivers clamoring for better roads went up. Southwest Michigan was within increasingly easy reach of city dwellers, especially captains of industry like Louis Rueckheim, one of the inventors of Cracker Jack. Louis Rueckheim built his house in Lakeside in 1918 and 19. A substantial house, 5 bedrooms plus 2 more for servants' quarters, with relatively sparse surrounding duneland and fields transformed by famed landscape architect Jens Jensen, who had designed gardens for some of Henry Ford's estates. In March 1919, Jensen submitted an elaborate landscape plan to the Rueckheims. Lots of fruit trees, crabapple, plum, grapevines, exotic bushes like sheepberry, juneberry, and Indian currant, flowering plants, witch hazel and Persian lilacs, phlox and hepatica, and formal gardens. Louis and Margaret Rueckheim were drawn to Lakeside by love. Their daughter Estelle had married Fred Warren from a prominent local family, the son of E.K. Warren, who had made a fortune and put Three Oaks on the map with his invention of featherbone in the 1880s. E.K. and his family spent summer months in Lakeside at a home called Vine Cottage. The new Rueckheim home was a mile north of Vine Cottage, just south of Cherry Ravine. Louis Rueckheim had made his fortune with brother Frederick, who started a modest popcorn business after arriving in Chicago from Germany during the year of the Great Fire, 1871. Louis quickly became a partner, and the Rueckheim brothers branched out into candy making. Frederick was the marketer, and Louis the technician who came up with a big innovation in 1896.
He develops the process for which The popcorn, the molasses can be mixed together and packaged without sticking together. That was huge.
Using the slogan, "The more you eat, the more you want," Cracker Jack was sold by street vendors, at circuses, and even at Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. In 1899, another technical innovation from a newcomer to the company. Henry Eckstein invented wax paper packaging so Cracker Jack could be sold in stores as well as by street vendors. Eckstein, soon to be made a full partner, would eventually own a home in Lakeside as well, near the Lakeside Inn. In 1908, a complete stranger, a songwriter named Jack Norworth, gave the Rueckheim brothers a big gift.
Take Me Out to the Ball Game, sung by Edward Meeker, Edison Record.
Norworth wrote Take Me Out to the Ball Game, a runaway musical hit, an anthem of sorts which provided a huge marketing boost for the Rueckheims.
Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack.
I think Rueckheim blindsided him, basically. He had no idea or interest in baseball.
Shame, for it's 1, 2.
But the Rueckheims knew how to capitalize on Norworth's musical mention. Baseball cards would be some of the earliest prizes offered in Cracker Jack boxes and are still among the most valuable collectibles.
Casey saw all the games.
Baseball fame and those prizes in every box, which soon went well beyond baseball, catapulted Cracker Jack to new heights.
Good and strong.
The Rueckheims were very wealthy indeed when Lewis began building his house near Cherry Ravine in Lakeside in 1919, though the company had just come through a rough patch.
And there's a parade in every city and town.
Just as the country was entering World War I, Fred Rueckheim's patriotism was called into question by soldiers who tried to visit his workers.
There were some recruitment people that came through and said, "Can we recruit from your employees?" And he said, "Absolutely not." He could be a prickly fellow.
In their complaint, the soldiers also claimed Rueckheim had a picture of German Field Marshal von Hindenburg on his desk. Frederick insisted he backed the American war effort, but did not want recruiters in his building during production hours, claiming he would have allowed them to talk to his workers during lunch break or after work was done. And Rueckheim claimed he had photos not only of von Hindenburg, but of all heads of state involved in the war.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun.
Within a year, Rueckheim Brothers advertising took on a decidedly patriotic tone, the prizes as well. And the company got a new mascot, a little sailor boy, Jack, modeled after Fred's grandson, and his dog Bingo, adorning every Cracker Jack box, all aimed at reaffirming the company's red, white, and blue loyalties.
Hard not to pine, to be proud, her boys in line.
The Rueckheim home in Lakeside was being completed as the war ended, and within a few years, the Rueckheims and Warrens were hosting Cracker Jack employees there for an annual day of country fun.
The activities ranged from bathing beauty contests to dancing. There was a pie eating contest.
6 busloads of Cracker Jack workers came to the 1925 outing, treated to beach time and ball games, music by a German band, a Der Sauf contest. Der Sauf is German for the booze. All presided over by the senior leadership, Lewis and Frederick Rueckheim and Henry Eckstein, with the Cracker Jack Company flag flying overhead. Within a few years, the Rueckheim brothers and Eckstein all died, but their descendants summered in Lakeside for decades. The 1945 Facts and Fancies of Lakeside contained tributes from Lillian Rueckheim and Henry Eckstein Jr., and a Cracker Jack ad. Fred and Estelle Rueckheim Warren moved to Lakeside full-time in their later years. The Roaring Twenties brought other industrialists. Harold Swift of the meatpacking family bought a large house just south of the Cracker Jack compound. Swift had grand ceremonial gardens and a working farm, raising prize-winning Jersey cattle and exotic pheasants. And as chairman of the board of the University of Chicago for a quarter century, Swift brought university trustees to his country home at annual long-term planning conferences as late as the 1950s. As Swift was buying his house in 1923, Ernest Stevens and his family were building a home just a few hundred feet south. The Stevens and their 4 boys sometimes lived on the beach while the home was under construction. The Stevens had summered in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and almost bought the home they'd rented there. Instead, they decided to build in Lakeside, their construction costs totaling about $24,000. The family had made money in insurance, a department store, and hotels. Ernest Stevens ran Chicago's largest hotel, the LaSalle. He sometimes came to his Michigan home via seaplane, thrilling kids in the neighborhood. The Stevens would open the world's largest hotel, the Stevens Hotel, in 1927, 3,000 rooms, but the Depression would bring tragedy to the Stevens clan. In February 1933, Ernest Stevens, his father, and brother were all accused of illegally funneling money from their insurance company to their hotels. 6 weeks later, Ernest's father suffered a massive stroke, and his brother, Raymond, committed suicide. 6 months after that, Ernest Stevens went on trial for embezzlement. In October, he was convicted, facing up to a decade in prison. That conviction, however, was reversed a year later, an appeals court finding that the Stevens family's mistaken investments were a far cry from a felonious, fraudulent scheme to enrich themselves. But the case took a huge toll on Stevens' family, reputation, and finances. He managed to hang on to the Lakeside house working as a hotel manager. Indeed, the home still belongs to his descendants. One of those descendants, his son John, here getting help with his necktie in the 1920s, would retain an allegiance to Lakeside for decades. As a young Chicago lawyer, he's seen here at a wedding at Harold Swift's farm in 1950. John married a Lakeside girl, Betty Sheeran, and they built their own getaway near the Stevens ancestral home. His career, though, took him away. After John Paul Stevens was confirmed as a U.S. Supreme Court Justice in 1975 and moved to Washington, he sold his Lakeside house to his brother Bill, though John Paul returned to rented quarters in the area often. Prohibition brought Chicago's cops and robbers to this area in the 1920s. Al Capone frequented southwest Michigan so much that one author dubbed it Capone's Playground. Capone said to have enjoyed card games with cronies at the Lakeside Inn, ironically not far from the second home of George E.Q. Johnson, the prosecutor who would later send Capone to prison for tax fraud. The 20s also brought a friend of George Johnson's, the poet and performer Carl Sandburg, to the area. First as a weekender to a house nicknamed Wren Cottage near Tower Hill. His wife Paula worried that her husband, then in his 40s, was becoming exhausted from writing poems, histories, and regular columns for the Chicago Daily News, along with doing lectures across the country that included singing folk songs.
And when she saw this lovely land, her heart was filled with joy straightway.
In Michigan, Sandburg wrote a friend, I am under strict orders to shun work, to play, and be irresponsible as the birds, the bees, and the bums. Eventually, Sandburg and his family moved to Michigan. For a few years, he commuted to his job at the Chicago Daily News, but by 1932, the family lived year-round in a house in Harbert's Birchwood subdivision, where, as a child, Sue Chapman was his neighbor.
I can remember his manner of speech, which was very sing-song.
Oh, I read things as a boy that had mystery of sound and rhythm.
Sandburg was an odd and fascinating neighbor. He spent most daylight hours up in a third-floor office working, demanding quiet, quoting an old sea captain telling his crew, all I want from you is silence and damned little of that. For lunch,
I just remember Mrs. Sandburg carrying a tray up to the top of the stairs. She'd set it on the top stair, and the door, of course, was closed. And she'd probably knock on the door to tell him it was there. But
Paula Sandburg, it was said, raised their children with the impression that their father was a genius with unique faculties. She was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of Chicago herself, and in Michigan, she bred a herd of goats that over time would number more than 200 and would win major prizes. Sandburg would describe Paula and daughter Helga as sharks at goat genetics, bragging of the prizes their goats won, and even dubbing his place in Harbert the Paw Paw Patch and Chickaming Goat Farm.
I spent a lot of time in the barns when I was small. I loved the kids, and they loved to suck your fingers. Their tongue was just like a piece of sandpaper.
Sandburg wrote of Harbert, "It is an odd corner of the world, a slow sickle of beach curving 22 miles to the headland." When he turned 60 in 1938, he told an interviewer, "I've traveled from coast to coast and beyond, and I find Harbert best of all. Lake Michigan is beautiful, and I love this spot." In Harbert, Sandburg wrote mostly about Abraham Lincoln. Books on Lincoln crowded his home. Sandburg figured he'd read 4,000 volumes about Lincoln and his times by the time he produced his own 2,400-page masterwork, Abraham Lincoln, The War Years, which would win him the 1940 Pulitzer Prize for History.
But it ran into something like 1.25 million words. The 6 volumes make the longest biography ever written in the Western Hemisphere.
Sandburg often went outside to write, to take in the sun on a widow's walk just off his third-floor office.
He liked the sun without anything on, put his typewriter on one crate on the long way, and he'd sit on another.
Sue Chapman thinks writing in the Buff was part sun worship, part delight in scandalizing a neighbor.
I think he was amused by Reverend Tibbetts' reaction.
As much as he admired it while he worked, Sandburg almost never went to the beach during the day. But in the evenings, guitar in hand, he'd walk to visit friends like Ruth and Kenneth Holden, friends who'd keep some bourbon on hand since drinking was frowned upon in the Sandburg home. He'd tell stories and sing offbeat folk songs.
"'Twas here the Queen of Sheba came with Solomon of old."
His friend Ruth Holden would recall later, he was a ham. He loved to perform, but it was a treat to let him have the floor.
Lovely land, her heart was filled with joy.
One of Sandburg's local pals was Three Oaks butcher Ed Dreyer, who displayed some Sandburg doggerel in his store, though it may have actually been written by the poet's daughter, Helga. "Thank you, dear Eddie, for your bottles and basket. We've only one question, and now we will ask it. We know cheese in a tub and that liver's not bony, but how in the world do you make your bologna?" The Sandburgs moved away after 13 years in 1945. Carl, writing that his wife's health and more space for the animals took them to North Carolina, adding, "I told them I'd go any place they picked." But leaving Harbert was hard for him. Neighbor Kay Wood gave a New Year's Eve party just before the Sandburgs left, and she recalled he came in quietly, put a bottle of whiskey on top of the piano, looked at us all with tears in his eyes, and walked out without saying a word. Most second homeowners in this area come from Chicago, but Paul Hoffman headed the Studebaker Car Company in South Bend when he acquired a beachfront home in Union Pier in the 1930s. Hoffman was a business wunderkind, a super salesman, a millionaire car dealer in Los Angeles by age 33. In his 40s, he moved to South Bend to take the reins at Studebaker, helping rescue the failing company from receivership. It was in this time frame that Hoffman and his family began weekending at a big white house on the lake in Union Pier. Among those who visited the Hoffman compound, comedian Bob Hope, a Studebaker spokesman. Hoffman's public profile grew. During the war, he formed a group to study how to avoid a recession when the war ended. And in 1948, President Harry Truman would name Hoffman to head the Marshall Plan, America's ambitious effort to rebuild European economies following World War II. Hoffman got generally high marks for his work administering U.S. aid through the Economic Cooperation Administration, pressuring European countries to integrate their economies. Back home, Hoffman argued the billions in foreign aid to Europe were the best way to keep the Soviet Union at bay and prevent the Cold War from becoming a hot war. "We have confounded both the communists and the other cynics," he wrote in 1949. Hoffman became a friend and confidant of General Dwight Eisenhower, and as the 1952 election approached, he urged Ike to run for president. His persuasion efforts may have included bringing the general to his beachfront White House in Michigan, though the Eisenhower Library can't confirm that.
Mr. Paul Gray Hoffman, chairman of the Advisory Committee to the Citizens for Eisenhower.
Every day, the case for Eisenhower has gotten stronger and stronger.
Even as candidate Eisenhower remained silent on the strident anti-communist crusades of Senator Joseph McCarthy, Hoffman assured moderate Republicans privately that Eisenhower was opposed to McCarthy's tactics.
There has been too much fear. There has been too much hate.
One Eisenhower advisor complained, Paul Hoffman comes in like a hurricane. His values are great, but he likes to be the bridegroom at each wedding, the corpse at every funeral. But Hoffman and Eisenhower remained close after Hoffman returned to Studebaker in the 50s, sharing a love of golf and middle-of-the-road Republican politics. Hoffman sold his Union Pier property in 1960. It became the Gintaras Resort. The White House, where he may have urged Eisenhower to make a White House run, was finally torn down in 2020. Chicago mayors have long escaped the city they run for R&R across the lake in southwest Michigan. The first was very likely Anton Cermak, who summered in this unusual stone house on the lakeshore in Union Pier's Sturgeon Beach community in the 1920s. The home had been built about a decade earlier by Oscar Eklund, an industrialist and prominent Chicago Democrat. Eklund, the general manager of Central Cut Glass Company, decorated his house with colorful glass shards, both outside and above the fireplace mantel. Birch bark logs lined the walls. It had, and even decades later still has, the look of a hunting lodge. Cermak was said to bring guests over from Chicago by the boatload for weekends that included all-night poker games and then illegal beer. But he enjoyed the house for only a few years.
Mr. Mayor.
Just 2 years in office, Mayor Cermak had traveled to Miami in 1933, attending an outdoor rally with President-elect Franklin Roosevelt.
Mayor Cermak, critically wounded, is carried to Mr. Roosevelt's car. Resting in the arms of the President-elect, he is rushed to a hospital.
Cermak died of his wounds nearly 3 weeks later, and within 2 weeks after that, his assassin Giuseppe Zangara had been tried and put to death.
The men are right, the President is not right.
Other Chicago mayors had longer to enjoy Michiana summers and weekends. The family of Richard J. Daley had a place in Grand Beach for decades, so of course Mayor Richard M. Daley spent his boyhood there and continued to enjoy area beaches and golf courses when he became mayor. Harold Washington spent downtime at a friend's farm near Three Oaks. It's unclear if he ever bought Michiana property. Rahm Emanuel took breaks from mayoral pressures at his Union Pier beach home. Another part-time Union Pier resident never ran for office, though he'd had an extraordinary run into history. Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals in sprint races and the long jump at the Olympic Games of 1936 in Berlin. His performance, a powerful rebuke to the Aryan supremacy claims of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime of the host country, and a boost for African American morale and the cause of civil rights in the U.S. Owens became a huge celebrity, riding down Broadway in a ticker-tape parade on his return from Berlin. But in 1930s America, a black athlete could not easily convert Olympic heroism into work.
Cuba. Jesse Owens, the ebony streak of Olympic Games, celebrates turning professional by racing against a horse.
Owens was criticized for some of his money-making gambits, but responded, "People said it was degrading for an Olympic champion to run against a horse, but what was I supposed to do? I had 4 gold medals, but you can't eat 4 gold medals."
So what?
A great Olympic champion and hailed as the top track performer since 1900, this is your life.
Owens remained in the public eye, working over the years in public relations, youth sports programs, owning a dry cleaner, and raising 3 daughters with wife Ruth.
Beverly, Mrs. Donald Prather with the Southside Bank in Chicago, and your granddaughter...
It wasn't until those daughters were grown, with families of their own, and when he was about to retire, that Jesse Owens bought his house in Union Pier.
It was just a peaceful place for him, where you could totally relax and, didn't have people asking 1,000 questions.
Union Pier offered a family haven, grandchildren visiting often, and a relaxed pace.
He would spend time in the mornings walking around the community. He would walk and talk to anybody that passed by, and everybody was champ. Nobody had a name. Everybody was champ.
Owens did not dwell on his own championship past, but he remained fiercely competitive. His favorite sporting time in Michiana? Golf with old Olympic teammate Ralph Metcalfe, who'd become an Illinois congressman.
They were competitors till the end. And you could always tell who won or lost when they came in the house, you know. There were bragging rights, certainly, but, and I would imagine small wagers, nothing major.
The Owens spent lots of time around the pool. His daughters say he basked in the warmth of family, though they describe him as fundamentally a formal person.
My father was a sharecropper, and we worked the cotton fields and the cornfields of Alabama.
Very conscious of proper speech, proper etiquette, proper dress, proper behavior. All of those things were emphasized. He got a whole lot of standards, and he would like for you to meet them. Because it was important as an African American to put your best face forward for acceptance.
Jesse Owens, who was not invited to the White House immediately after his Olympic triumphs, was finally awarded a Congressional Medal of Honor by Gerald Ford in 1976. Owens, in his later years a heavy smoker, died of lung cancer in 1980. The Union Pier home stayed in the Owens family for nearly 4 decades after that. America's best-known movie critics often disagreed.
The film was very entertaining.
I didn't think the film was that entertaining.
But Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel both gave thumbs up to Downtime in Southwest Michigan. Both whiled away summer and weekend time in Michiana, but it was Ebert who became an ardent booster of the area, blogging about it as his other neighborhood, a place he wrote where the past coexists with the present. There are old-fashioned pleasures, and not everything is in a strip mall and belongs to a chain. Actual human beings own places and sell you stuff it's fun to buy. This area is known as Harbor Country. In 1980, Ebert began spending free time in Union Pier not far from Jesse Owens' place. Ebert and his good friend Bob Zonka, a colleague from the Chicago Sun-Times who had just purchased the New Buffalo Times, bought a duplex, each occupying a unit. They entertained often, guest lists including journalism colleagues and sometimes novelist Andrew Greeley, the priest turned best-selling author who had a beach house in Grand Beach. Later, Ebert would buy fancier digs, the lakefront harbor home built for globe-trotting pro wrestler Joe Savoldi, and later occupied by Cecil Pond, the man credited with inventing the tractor lawnmower. But Ebert and Siskel were far from the most famous TV folks who got away to Michiana.
Is she qualified for this job? There's been a lot of talk about...
Oprah Winfrey had become a TV hit in Chicago, and at Roger Ebert's urging, had taken her talk show national in syndication in 1986. By the time she bought a 164-acre farm just south of Three Oaks in LaPorte 2 years later, she was the #1 talk show host in the country. Oprah's Hoosier Hideaway, an Indianapolis magazine called the place, 9,700 square feet, 5 bedrooms and 4 fireplaces in the main house, with an 8-bedroom guest house, a pool, tennis court, and horses that Oprah herself didn't ride, but that Allison Gross took care of for her.
It was more just to watch them and enjoy them out in the pasture, and for her guests to come and ride if they would like. She also had cattle, too, that she did the same thing. She'd watch them out in pasture as well.
The Indianapolis magazine reported that Oprah's sightings were not uncommon, though it couldn't manage to get any photos of her in Indiana. Locals reported seeing her jog on roads near her compound. Rough roads led to controversy in 1996, Oprah complaining that though her taxes had nearly doubled in 8 years as a county homeowner, her guests had suffered car damage from badly kept roads. County officials made light of Oprah's letter, some suggesting the county auction it off to pay for road repair. The commission president joking that Oprah flew to her place by helicopter, well above any potholes. But tweaking Oprah backfired. More than 100 local residents wrote the LaPorte paper to complain politicians were disrespecting their part-time neighbor. For years, only a select few had seen what lay behind the front door of Oprah's Hoosier Hideaway. But the January 2002 issue of Oprah's O magazine invited readers to come on in and enjoy Christmas dinner at the Winfrey farm, with her boyfriend Stedman Graham, family, and friends. Over several pages, Oprah described her love of Christmas festivity and of entertaining, at which she was a master.
I did have a couple dinners. She invited me in for some dinners a couple times. She's a very good cook, very easy to be around, made everybody feel comfortable.
Having moved her primary residence to California and purchased getaways in Hawaii and Florida, Oprah sold her Michiana farm after 16 years in 2004. But the charms of this area continued to lure those seeking beauty and relaxation, the feeling Carl Sandburg described in his poem Lake Michigan Morning. Blue and white come out, riders of an early fall morning. The blue by itself, the white by itself, a young lamb white crossed on a clear water blue. Blue rollers talked on a white beach sand.